A young millionaire prepares for the wedding that promises to consolidate his fortune and social status. Meanwhile, a retired police dog demonstrates unsettling behavior, sniffing every move of the groom. At the climax of the ceremony, the dog's instinct reveals a suspicious capsule, exposing a hidden plan that no one could imagine. An attentive observer perceives that what seemed like a perfect party is, in fact, a game of deception and silent threats. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us what city you're watching us from. We continue. Chapter 1. Fragile Promises. The city of Chicago awoke that October Thursday to an overcast sky, typical of a Midwestern autumn, when the clouds play hide-and-seek with the sun, leaving a dampness in the air that clings to the skin. In the Lincoln Park neighborhood, St. Jude's Cathedral raised its century-old spires between modern buildings and old brownstones, a silent witness to so many stories of love, promises, and also the disappointments that life insists on delivering when we least expect them. Edward Vance parked his imported car in front of the church and sat there for a few minutes, observing the facade through the fogged-up windshield. 32 years old, hair always slicked back with a discreet gel, an Italian suit that cost more than many people earned in 6 months. To the eyes of anyone passing by on the street, Edward was the personification of success, the heir to a construction company that was erecting buildings all over the city's south side, always seen at high society parties, always with the right smile, the right tie, the right words. But if someone had looked more closely at that moment, they would have seen that his hands were trembling slightly as he held the steering wheel. They would have seen him take a deep breath, like someone trying to calm an internal storm that no one else could see. He got out of the car and walked to the church entrance, greeting Father Michael, who was organizing some books in the entrance hall, with a nod. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 days from then, a Saturday at noon, and every detail had to be perfect. Edward had hired the best professionals in Chicago, flowers imported from the Netherlands, decorations by one of the most sought-after designers in the city, an award-winning caterer, a live band and a DJ for the party that would take place in one of the most elegant ballrooms in the Gold Coast. Everything planned with military precision, everything designed to impress, to make a mark, to consolidate his position among the Chicago elite. While Father Michael showed him the final adjustments to the altar, Edward pretended to pay attention, but his mind was far away. He thought about the documents he had signed 3 days earlier at the family lawyer's office, documents that would protect his assets if something went wrong. He thought about the whispered conversations with Richard Allen, his best friend since their private school days, his best man, his accomplice in so many plans that could never come to light. He thought mainly about how he had gotten to this point, about to marry a woman he truly loved, but whose love had also become a piece on a much larger and more dangerous chessboard than she could possibly imagine. On the other side of the city, in the Wicker Park neighborhood, Isabella Miller was finishing teaching her class of teenagers at a public school. An art teacher for 7 years, she had that calm demeanor of someone who had found her purpose in life. At 29, Isabella usually wore her brown hair in a messy bun, comfortable clothes that allowed for movement, and always carried a backpack full of notebooks, paints, and brushes. Her brown eyes had that sparkle of someone who still believes they can make a difference in the world, even when the world insists on proving otherwise. After class, she took the L train to the north side, to the animal shelter where she volunteered twice a week. There, among rescued dogs, abandoned cats, and a few animals. In recovery, Isabella found a piece she couldn't quite explain. But her favorite, without a doubt, was Thor, a 5-year-old German shepherd with an imposing build, impeccable black and tan fur, and intelligent eyes that seemed to understand more than an animal should. Thor had been a police dog for 3 years, working patrol and substance detection operations on the south side of Chicago. A hip injury forced him into early retirement, which is when Isabella met him and decided to adopt him. That afternoon, while walking with Thor through the park near the shelter, Isabella thought about the approaching wedding. She had met Edward at an art exhibition 6 months earlier. He was there with some clients from his construction company. She was exhibiting some of her students' work. Their eyes met. The conversation flowed naturally, and before Isabella knew it, She was having dinner with him at a sophisticated Japanese restaurant, listening to Edward talk about his dreams, his plans, his ambitions. He was so different from the men she usually knew. He had that confidence, that assurance of someone who had always known what he wanted from life. The courtship was fast, intense. Edward took her to places she had never imagined visiting. Dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, weekend trips to the lakeside cottages in Michigan, expensive gifts that she always said weren't necessary, but which, deep down, made her feel special. Gradually, Isabella fell in love not only with the man, but with the life he represented. A life far from the tight end-of-month bills, far from crowded buses, far from the worries that had always been part of her reality as the daughter of a housewife and a retired bus driver. When Edward proposed during a candlelit dinner on the terrace of his apartment with a view overlooking Millennium Park, Isabella said yes without hesitation. But now, walking with Thor under the park's trees as the sun began to set, she felt a strange pang in her chest. A feeling she couldn't name, but it was there, insistent, like a song playing softly in the back of her mind. Thor stopped suddenly, his ears alert, focused on something Isabella couldn't see. It was a characteristic of his, this state of constant vigilance, a legacy of his years of police training. But lately, Thor had been behaving differently, especially when Edward visited the small apartment Isabella shared with a friend in Wicker Park. The dog would avoid getting close to him, always staying on the defensive, sometimes growling softly when Edward made a sudden move. At first, Isabella thought it was just a matter of adjustment. After all, Thor was a dog trained to detect threats, and maybe he was just being protective of her. But as the weeks went by, the German Shepherd's behavior began to bother her. Thor would sniff Edward's bags when he wasn't looking. He would always position himself between them when they were on the couch. Once he even tugged at the hem of Edward's pants as he was about to leave, as if he wanted to stop him from going or perhaps stop him from staying. Isabella mentioned it to Edward a few times, always in a joking tone, trying not to seem like she was making a big deal of it. Edward would laugh, say Thor was just jealous that he would get used to it soon. But Isabella noticed something in Edward's eyes when he looked at the dog. It wasn't exactly fear, it was more like caution, as if he were always measuring the distance, always assessing the animal's movements. That night, after dropping Thor off at the apartment and taking a long shower, Isabella was sitting on the couch with her phone when she received a message from Edward. He said he was finalizing some details for the ceremony and would stop by around 9 o'clock to go over the final guest list. Isabella replied with a heart emoji and tossed her phone aside. Thor was lying at her feet, but as soon as Isabella mentioned that Edward was coming, the dog lifted his head, his ears attentive. It was as if he understood, as if he knew. Isabella stroked his head, feeling the soft fur under her fingers. "You don't like him very much, do you, my love?" she whispered to the dog. Thor looked at her with those deep eyes, and Isabella had the strange feeling that the animal was trying to tell her something, to warn her about something she couldn't yet see. When Edward arrived, punctual as always, he brought a folder of documents and that smile that made Isabella's heart race. He kissed her lingeringly, asked about her day, commented on a difficult meeting he'd had with investors. Thor, as usual, kept his distance, lying in the corner of the room but with his eyes fixed on the visitor. They sat at the small, cozy kitchen table, so different from Edward's spacious apartment in River North. As they reviewed the guest list, making notes, crossing out names, adding others, Isabella watched Edward out of the corner of her eye. He seemed more tense than usual. The lines around his eyes were more pronounced, as if he hadn't been sleeping well. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he held the pen. "Is everything okay?" she asked, placing her hand on his. Edward looked up, and for a moment, Isabella saw something there. A shadow, a doubt, perhaps even fear. But it was just for an instant. Soon the smile returned, reassuring, confident. "Of course, love. It's just the stress of the preparations. I want everything to be perfect for you." But Isabella wasn't completely convinced, and neither was Thor. The dog got up and walked to the table, positioning himself between Edward and Isabella, his eyes fixed on the man. Edward instinctively leaned back in his chair, trying to disguise the movement as if he were just stretching. "Thor, go to your spot," Isabella called, but the dog didn't move. He remained there, a silent but firm barrier. Edward forced a laugh. "I really don't think he likes me." Isabella took Thor by the collar and led him to the bedroom, closing the door. When she returned, Edward was putting the documents back in the folder, his face still pale. "Sorry about that," she said. "I don't know what's gotten into him lately." "Don't worry. After the wedding, when we're living together, he'll get used to it." But there was something in Edward's voice that didn't sound genuine, and Isabella, who had always trusted her intuition, began to feel that unease grow inside her, like a root spreading slowly but relentlessly. In the following days, the wedding preparations consumed all of Isabella's time. Dress fittings, meetings with the decorator, choosing the menu, finalizing the playlist with the band. Every detail required a decision, and Isabella found herself increasingly immersed in a world that, until a few months ago, was completely foreign to her. Her teacher friends made jokes about how she was becoming part of the Chicago elite, but always with that tone of envy disguised as humor that Isabella pretended not to notice. One afternoon, Isabella was at the designer's studio, trying on her dress for the third time. It was a stunning piece, in white satin with delicate embroidery on the hem and back, a modest but elegant neckline. As the seamstress made the final adjustments, Isabella looked at herself in the mirror and almost didn't recognize herself. Who was that woman reflected there? The art teacher who took the L train every day? The volunteer who spent her Saturdays at the animal shelter? Or was it someone new, someone she was still getting to know? Her phone rang. It was a message from Richard Allen, the best man. He said he needed to talk to her about a surprise gift he was preparing for Edward and asked if she could meet him for a quick coffee. Isabella found it strange, as she barely knew Richard, but she replied yes, that she could meet him the next day. The meeting took place at a chic coffee shop on Michigan Avenue. Richard was a tall man with broad shoulders, blonde hair, and light eyes that contrasted with his tanned skin. He wore a suit without a tie, expensive sneakers, and a watch that probably cost as much as Isabella's car. He was a partner in a tech company, and according to Edward, his best friend since they were 13. Richard ordered an espresso and got straight to the point. "Isabella, I wanted to talk to you about Edward." Isabella's heart sped up. "About what, exactly?" Richard stirred the sugar in his coffee, avoiding looking directly at her. "Look, I've known Edward for a long time. We grew up together, went through a lot, and I can guarantee you one thing, he truly loves you." Isabella frowned. "Why do I get the feeling there's a but coming?" Richard finally met her gaze. "Because there is. Isabella, Edward is going through a tough time with his business. The construction company has been facing some financial problems. Nothing serious, nothing that can't be fixed, but it's been stressful for him. I just wanted you to know so you'd understand if he's been more distant or worried." Isabella felt a tightness in her chest. "Why didn't he tell me this?" "Because he doesn't want to worry you. Because he wants this wedding to be perfect. You know how Edward is, always wanting to solve everything himself, always wanting to appear in control." They talked for a few more minutes, but Isabella was barely paying attention. Her mind was elsewhere, processing this information, trying to fit it in with all the other small, strange things she had been noticing. The phone calls Edward took in another room, the increasingly rare visits to her apartment, the way he avoided talking about the future beyond the wedding, as if their life would only begin after that ceremony. When Isabella got home that afternoon, Thor greeted her at the door as always with that genuine joy that only dogs can show. She knelt and hugged the animal, feeling tears threaten to escape. Thor licked her face as if he understood she needed that comfort. "What do you know that I don't?" she whispered to the dog. "What are you trying to tell me?" Thor just looked at her, those dark eyes full of a wisdom that transcended training, that came from a deeper, more instinctive place. And Isabella, for the first time since Edward had entered her life, allowed herself to question if she was really making the right choice. That night, alone in her room while Thor slept at the foot of the bed, Isabella picked up her phone and started searching for information about Edward's construction company online. She found recent articles about delays in projects, lawsuits from small investors, rumors about liquidity problems. Nothing too alarming, but enough to confirm what Richard had said. The Vance family business wasn't doing as well as Edward always made it seem. But there was something else. In one of the articles, a brief mention of a financial agreement Edward had recently closed with a group of foreign investors. The wedding was mentioned in passing as part of a strategy to consolidate business relationships. Isabella read it several times, trying to understand. Was that common? To mix a wedding with business in that way? She turned off her phone and stared at the dark ceiling of her room, listening to Thor's quiet breathing. Tomorrow would be Friday. In 1 week she would be walking down the aisle of St. Jude's Cathedral, dressed as a bride, about to say "I do" to a man she might not know as well as she thought. A man who, for reasons she didn't yet fully understand, made her police dog, trained to detect danger, constantly on alert. Isabella closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. And when she finally did fall asleep, she dreamed of long corridors and closed doors, of keys that wouldn't open locks, of voices calling her name that she couldn't place. She woke before dawn, her heart racing, Thor already awake beside her, watching the bedroom door as if expecting something or someone to enter at any moment. The last few days before the wedding passed in a blur of appointments and preparations. A bachelorette party with her friends at a spa, dinner with Edward's family, where his future mother-in-law, Beatrice, an elegant and controlling woman, made a point of giving several unsolicited pieces of advice on how to be a good wife. A bridal shower at a distant cousin's house. Each event was a piece of the puzzle that formed the picture of the life Isabella was about to step into, and at each of these moments, she smiled, said thank you, and pretended to be completely happy. But inside, a small but persistent voice kept asking, "Are you sure? Do you really know this man? Do you know what you're getting into?" On the eve of the wedding, Edward showed up at her apartment for one last conversation before the ceremony. According to tradition, they wouldn't see each other again until Isabella walked down the aisle. He was nervous, more than she had ever seen him. They sat on the couch, Thor keeping his distance as always. "Tomorrow," Edward said, holding her hands, "tomorrow you'll be my wife. I can't believe this is really happening." Isabella forced a smile. "I can hardly wait either." But her voice came out shaky, and Edward noticed. He tilted his head, studying her face. "Are you scared?" Isabella took a deep breath. "It's normal to be scared before a wedding, isn't it?" "Of course it is. I am too, but, Isabella, I want you to know something." Edward paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "No matter what happens, no matter what you might hear or think, know that I love you, truly. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." There was something in the intensity of his words that frightened Isabella. Why was he talking like that? As if he were saying goodbye or preparing for something. "Edward, what's going on?" she asked, her voice firmer. "Now, if there's something you need to tell me now, before tomorrow." For a moment, Edward seemed about to speak, his eyes filled with something that looked like pain, or perhaps remorse. But then he shook his head, kissed her forehead, and stood up. "Everything's fine, love. I'm just emotional. I'll see you at the church tomorrow." And he left, leaving Isabella alone with Thor, and a premonition that grew like a shadow on the wall, silent but undeniable. That night, Isabella barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw disconnected images. Edward signing papers, Richard whispering something in her ear, Thor growling, the church empty and silent, and then a feeling of falling, as if the floor had disappeared from under her feet. She woke at 5 in the morning, her heart pounding. Thor was sitting beside the bed, staring at her, a silent guardian. Isabella reached out and touched the dog's head. "You'll be with me tomorrow, won't you?" she asked, and Thor barked once, softly, as if confirming a promise. And as the first ray of sunlight began to illuminate the room, Isabella felt that something was about to change, that the next day would not just be her wedding day, but the day when the whole truth, hidden under layers of smiles and promises, would finally come to light. And she, whether she wanted to or not, would have to be ready to face whatever was waiting for her at the altar of St. Jude's Cathedral. Chapter 2. The Day of Truth. Saturday dawned with a surprisingly clear sky over Chicago, as if the city itself had decided to cooperate with the ceremony that would mark that October day. Isabella woke to the sound of her alarm at 7 in the morning, her body heavy from a restless night, but with that mix of anxiety and expectation that everyone feels on their wedding day. Thor was lying beside the bed, and when she moved, the dog immediately stood up, alert as always. The apartment was quiet. Her roommate, Julia, had left the night before to stay at her mother's, making space for the bridesmaids and Isabella's mother to arrive early to help her get ready. Isabella got up slowly, walked to the kitchen, and made coffee while looking out the window at the surrounding buildings. The normal life of Chicago. Beginning another day. Cars passing, people walking hurriedly, grocery delivery drivers on their bikes. Everything so common, so every day, while she was about to live what was supposed to be the most special day of her life. Why then did she feel so strange? Why this weight in her chest that wouldn't go away? This feeling that something important was being forgotten, or worse, being deliberately ignored. Isabella drank her coffee in silence, Thor sitting at her feet. The dog hadn't eaten his morning kibble, which was unusual. He just watched her with those deep eyes, and Isabella again had that unsettling feeling that the animal knew something she didn't. At 8 o'clock the doorbell rang. It was her bridesmaids, Carol, a math teacher and friend from college, and Francis, her cousin on her mother's side. They came in excitedly, carrying bags of makeup, a portable clothes steamer, and a bottle of sparkling wine that Carol insisted on opening immediately for a toast. "To the bride," Carol said, filling 3 plastic cups. They toasted, and Isabella forced a smile as she drank the bubbly liquid. Carol and Francis chatted excitedly about the preparations, about how beautiful the church would be, about the party that night, but Isabella could barely follow the conversation. Her mind was elsewhere, always returning to the conversation with Edward the night before, to his strange words, to the way Thor reacted to his presence. "Isa, are you okay?" Francis asked, noticing her distraction. Isabella blinked, returning to reality. Yes, just nervous, you know how it is." "Normal, honey. On my wedding day, I almost threw up 3 times, Carol laughed. But Isabella's laugh sounded fake even to herself, and Thor, who was lying in the corner of the living room, lifted his head, his ears attentive. At 9 o'clock, Marissa, Isabella's mother, arrived with the dress wrapped in a white garment bag. She was a short woman with graying hair tied in a bun, her face marked by years of hard work, but still beautiful, still full of a sweetness that life's hardships hadn't managed to erase. She hugged her daughter tightly, and Isabella felt her eyes sting. "My girl," Marissa whispered. "You look so beautiful." Isabella clung to her mother for longer than necessary, as if seeking in that hug a certainty she couldn't find within herself. Marissa, with that maternal intuition that sees beyond appearances, pulled back a little and studied her daughter's face. "Something's wrong," she stated, not asked. "No, Mom, everything's fine," Isabella lied. But Marissa's eyes said she didn't believe her. Still, she didn't press. She just held her daughter's face between her hands and said, "Remember what I always told you? Listen to your heart, my daughter. Always listen to your heart." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. A long bath, hair styled in soft waves that fell over her shoulders, makeup carefully applied by Carol, who had a natural talent for it. When it was finally time to put on the dress, it was almost 11 o'clock, and Isabella's nervousness had turned into an almost unbearable anxiety. The dress slid over her body like a second skin. The bridesmaids fastened the buttons on the back, adjusted the hem, and placed the veil. When Isabella finally looked at herself in the full-length mirror in the bedroom, for a moment she forgot all her worries. She was beautiful, truly beautiful. The woman staring back at her was someone out of a magazine, out of a fairy tale. Carol, Francis, and Marissa started to cry, and even Isabella felt tears threatening to smudge her makeup. But then Thor approached and sat beside her, and when Isabella looked at the dog, she saw that he didn't seem calm. His ears were back, his body tense, as if he were preparing for something. "We have to go," Carol announced, looking at her watch. "The church is 40 minutes from here, and Saturday traffic is unpredictable." They left in 2 cars. Marissa would drive Isabella's car, an old but well-kept Ford Focus, taking the bride and Thor. The bridesmaids would go in Carol's car. Isabella had insisted on bringing Thor, saying he was part of her life and she wanted him close on her most important day. In truth, she needed that animal by her side, needed that presence that, however strange, made her feel safer. The drive through the city was silent. Marissa drove with concentration, and Isabella looked out the window, watching Chicago pass by. The Wicker Park neighborhood gave way to the central area, then the drive east. The streets became narrower, the buildings older, until they finally reached Lincoln Park. St. Jude's Cathedral stood imposing on the corner, its white towers standing out against the blue sky. Cars were parked everywhere, people walking towards the entrance, and Isabella recognized a few faces, friends, colleagues, distant relatives, all there to witness this moment. But it was when she got out of the car and walked towards the side entrance of the church, the one reserved for the bride, that Isabella had the clear, undeniable feeling that she was making a mistake. Her feet felt heavy, her heart beat erratically, and Thor, by her side on the leash, pulled back discreetly as if trying to stop her from entering. "Thor, stop," she whispered, but the dog continued to resist. "He's nervous with so many people," Carol commented, but Isabella knew that wasn't it. Thor had been trained to work in crowds, in high-pressure situations. What was making him nervous wasn't the number of people, but something specific he sensed, something his trained animal instinct picked up, but that Isabella still couldn't identify. The side entrance led to a small room where the bride would wait until it was time to enter. Inside were Father Michael and 2 assistants, who helped Isabella with her veil and the hem of her dress. Outside, the voices of the guests, the soft music of the organ, and the collective murmur of a ceremony about to begin could be heard. Marissa kissed her daughter's forehead. "God bless you, my girl. I'm going to my seat, okay?" Isabella held her mother's hand before she left. "Mom," she began, but didn't know how to continue. How could she say she was scared? How could she admit she had doubts when more than 200 people were waiting there? How could she cancel a wedding whose party had already cost the equivalent of several years of her salary? Marissa squeezed her hand. "Listen to your heart," she repeated, and left. Isabella was left alone in the small room, just her and Thor. The dog was restless, pacing back and forth, stopping occasionally to look at the door that led into the church, growling softly. "What is it, Thor?" Isabella asked, kneeling beside him despite her dress. "What are you feeling?" Thor looked at her, and Isabella had the strange feeling that the animal was trying to communicate, was desperate to make her understand something crucial. But before she could process that thought, the door opened and Father Michael entered. "It's time, Isabella. Edward is already at the altar!" Isabella's heart raced. She stood up, smoothed her dress with trembling hands, and held her bouquet of white roses. Thor stood by her side, his leash in her hand. She had arranged with Edward for the dog to walk in with her. It would be one of the unique features of their wedding, something to make it special. The music changed. It was the wedding march, the signal that the bride was about to enter. The double doors of the church opened, and Isabella saw the central aisle stretching out before her. The wooden pews filled with all those faces turned towards her, and there at the end, at the altar decorated with white and gold flowers, was Edward. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, his hair combed back, his bow tie perfectly adjusted. Beside him, Richard, the best man, also looked impeccable. And both of them looked at Isabella with expressions she couldn't quite decipher. Edward seemed emotional, but also nervous, very nervous, and Richard had a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Isabella began to walk, slowly, each step measured, her dress brushing against the red carpet of the aisle. Thor walked beside her, but she could feel the tension in the leash, feel that the dog was resisting, that every step forward was a struggle against the animal's instinct. The guests whispered, admiring the dress, commenting on the bride's beauty, on the novelty of having a dog in the procession. But Isabella barely heard them. Her eyes were fixed on Edward, trying to find in his face a confirmation that she was doing the right thing, that all her doubts were just wedding day jitters. But the closer she got to the altar, the more the feeling of wrongness intensified, and Thor beside her began to pull on the leash with more force, his nails scratching the marble floor, his whole body tense. "Thor," she whispered, trying to control him. That's when it happened. When Isabella was about 10 yards from the altar, Thor stopped completely. He simply planted all 4 paws on the ground and refused to move forward. Isabella pulled the leash, trying to make him walk, but the dog was large, strong and trained. If he didn't want to move, no human force could make him. "Thor, please," she begged, but the dog started to bark. It wasn't an ordinary bark from a scared or excited dog. It was the alert bark he had been trained to use when he detected something dangerous. Loud, rhythmic, insistent. The murmur of the guests grew. Some laughed, thinking it was funny. Others looked confused. Edward at the altar had turned visibly pale, and Richard beside him took a step forward as if to intervene, but then stepped back. Isabella was paralyzed, caught between the embarrassment of the moment and the growing certainty that Thor wasn't just nervous. He was trying to protect her. From what she still didn't know, but the dog's instinct was too clear to be ignored. Father Michael approached her, trying to help. "Perhaps it's best if someone takes the dog outside," he suggested quietly. But Isabella shook her head. "No." She looked at Edward, who was now visibly uncomfortable, sweating despite the church's air conditioning. "Wait a minute, please." She knelt beside Thor, not caring about the dress, not caring about everyone's stares. "Thor, what is it?" she asked, looking into the animal's eyes. Show me what you're seeing." Thor stopped barking for a moment, looked at her, then looked at Edward. And then he did something that surprised everyone. He started to walk, not towards the altar, but towards the right side of the church, where the pews reserved for the groom's family were. Isabella, without much thought, followed the dog. She heard the whispers increase, heard someone ask what was happening, heard Edward's voice calling her name, but she kept following Thor. The dog stopped beside one of the front pews, where Beatrice Vance, Edward's mother, was sitting, a woman in her 60s, very well dressed, with an elegant hat and an expression that mixed surprise and indignation. Thor began to sniff the handbag at her feet. "Isabella, what is the meaning of this?" Beatrice asked, offended. But Thor was focused. He stuck his snout into the bag, and Beatrice tried to push him away, but the dog was faster. With a precise movement, Thor pulled something out of the bag. It was an envelope, a large manila envelope which fell to the floor. Isabella picked it up, her heart beating so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She looked at Beatrice, who was beet red, then at Edward, who had left the altar and was walking towards her. "Isabella, give me that," Edward said, holding out his hand. But there was something in his voice, a desperation that confirmed what Isabella was already suspecting. With trembling hands, she opened the envelope. Inside were documents. Lots of documents. Contracts, bank transfers, agreements. Isabella didn't understand everything. She wasn't in the legal or financial field, but she understood enough to see that those papers involved huge sums of money, involved foreign companies, involved her name, in several places, as if she were already a partner in businesses she didn't even know existed. "Edward, what is this?" she asked, her voice coming out firmer than she expected. Edward swallowed hard, looked at his mother, then at Richard, who had also approached. "Isabella, I can explain. After the ceremony we'll talk. I'll tell you everything." "No." Isabella took a step back. "Tell me now, in front of everyone who came here to see us get married. Tell me now what it means for me to be on these papers without knowing, without ever having signed anything." The church was in absolute silence. All 200 guests watched the scene, motionless, as if they were watching a movie and not a real ceremony. Edward ran a hand through his hair, messing up the perfect hairstyle. "Isabella, the construction company is in trouble, serious trouble. I needed a way to protect some assets, to reorganize the finances. These papers, he pointed to the envelope, are just a formality. After the wedding, you'd be my wife. We'd have to sort everything out together anyway. But I didn't even know these papers existed, Isabella retorted, feeling the tears finally escape. You were going to put me in businesses I don't even know about. Use my name without telling me. Make me sign things after the wedding without me knowing what I was getting into? Edward tried to approach, but Thor growled, placing himself between them. It wasn't like that. I love you, Isabella. I was just trying to protect what we were building. We haven't built anything, Isabella shouted, and her voice echoed through the church. You built a lie. You hid who you really are from me, what you really want. This wedding, she looked around at all those people, isn't about love. It's about business. It's about saving your company using my name, my trust, my naivety. Beatrice stood up, trying to intervene. Isabella, you don't understand. In the business world, things are like this. You will benefit too. You'll have a comfortable life. You'll have everything you've ever wanted. Isabella stared at her. You don't even know me. You don't know what I want. She turned back to Edward. You don't know either. Because if you did, you'd know that I want honesty, I want truth, I want a partner, not a manipulator. Edward was pale, sweating. Isabella, please. We can talk about this. We can work it out. But Isabella had already made up her mind. For the first time since Edward had entered her life, she was seeing clearly. Thor had been trying to warn her from the beginning. The animal's instinct, honed by years of training, had detected what she didn't want to see, that there was something wrong, something hidden, something dangerous about this man. She looked at Father Michael, who was watching everything with a sad but understanding expression. Father, I'm sorry for the disruption, but there won't be a wedding today. A buzz erupted in the church. Voices overlapped, people stood up, there was confusion, but Isabella didn't care. She took Thor by the leash, turned, and began to walk back down the aisle, her head held high, her wedding dress dragging on the floor, tears rolling freely down her face. Isabella! Edward shouted behind her, but she didn't stop. When she reached the church doors and stepped out into the midday sun, Isabella felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Thor barked, this time a joyful, approving bark. She knelt and hugged the dog tightly, sobbing into his soft fur. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for trying to protect me. Thank you for not giving up. Carol and Francis came running after her, followed by Marissa. All three were shocked, but when they saw Isabella's face, they understood that something very serious had happened. Isabella, what was all that? Carol asked. Isabella stood up, wiped her tears with the back of her hand, smudging her makeup. I'll tell you everything, but right now I just want to get out of here. Marissa hugged her daughter. Let's go home, my child. Let's go home. They walked to the car, Isabella still in her wedding dress, Thor by her side. Some guests came out of the church and watched from a distance, commenting, speculating, but Isabella didn't care. For the first time in months she felt free. Free from the lies, free from the manipulation, free from a future that would have been built on a false foundation. In the car, Marissa drove in silence while Isabella looked out the window. The city of Chicago continued its routine, indifferent to the personal drama that had just unfolded at St. Jude's Cathedral. And Isabella thought about everything she had almost lost: her identity, her autonomy, her ability to decide her own life. Thor was lying on the back seat, his head resting on Isabella's lap, and she stroked the animal's fur with infinite gratitude. That dog, which so many would consider just an animal, had been more loyal and more honest than the man she was about to marry. When they arrived at the apartment, Isabella walked in, still wearing her wedding dress, past Julia, who was just returning and was left speechless by the scene, and went straight to her room. She took off the dress, took off the veil, took off that whole fantasy of a perfect life she had almost bought into. She put on an old sweatshirt and pajama pants, tied her hair in a ponytail, and went back to the living room. Carol and Francis were already there, along with Julia and Marissa. They all looked at her with concern and curiosity. Isabella sat on the couch, Thor immediately by her side, and began to tell her story. She talked about the suspicions she'd had, about Edward's strange behavior, about the meeting with Richard, about the documents she'd found online, and finally about what she had discovered in the church. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. Carol was the first to speak. "Isa, you were so brave. A lot of women would have pretended they saw nothing, would have gone ahead with the wedding to avoid the embarrassment." Isabella shook her head. It wasn't courage. It was Thor. He knew. From the beginning, he knew something was wrong and tried to warn me. I was just too stupid to listen. Marissa sat next to her daughter and held her hand. "You listened when you needed to listen, my child. That's what matters." That night, Isabella didn't sleep much. She lay in bed, Thor at her feet as always, thinking about everything that had happened, all the decisions she had made, all the red flags she had chosen to ignore because she was in love, because she wanted to believe in the fairy tale. But there was something she had to do, something that couldn't wait until morning. She got up, grabbed her laptop, and started researching. She looked for lawyers specializing in financial fraud, read about similar cases, tried to understand exactly what kind of scheme Edward had tried to involve her in. The more she read, the more frightened she became. If she had gotten married, if she had signed those papers without knowing, she would have become legally responsible for debts and businesses she didn't even know about. Edward wasn't just trying to protect his assets. He was trying to transfer risk, trying to use the marriage as a legal shield for questionable financial operations. Thor lifted his head and looked at her as if sensing her agitation. Isabella reached out and petted the dog. "You saved me," she whispered. "You literally saved me from a disaster." And as the city of Chicago slept outside, Isabella began to plan her next steps. Because she wasn't just going to get out of this situation, she was going to make Edward answer for what he tried to do. She was going to ensure that no other woman fell into the same trap, and she was going to prove, especially to herself, that she was stronger than anyone imagined. Chapter 3. The Revelation. Sunday dawned grey, and Isabella woke up with the strange feeling that it had all been a nightmare. For a few seconds, still lying in bed with Thor sleeping at her feet, she almost believed that the wedding had happened normally, that she was married, that she was Mrs. Vance, but then she looked around, saw the wedding dress thrown over the chair in her room, and reality hit her like a bucket of cold water. Her phone had been off since the day before. She hadn't had the courage to turn it on, to see the messages that would surely be waiting, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. She got up, made coffee, fed Thor, and finally, with trembling hands, turned on the device. The notifications started pouring in, 53 unread messages, 22 missed calls, emails, social media messages, all piling up in a digital avalanche she didn't even know where to begin processing. Most were from Edward, desperate messages asking to talk, begging for a chance to explain, saying it had all been a misunderstanding. Some from Richard, more curt, more calculated, trying to downplay the incident. Messages from guests, some sympathetic, others curious, wanting to know what had really happened. And then, in the middle of it all, a message that made Isabella's heart stop for a second. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Isabella, my name is Clarissa Moore. I was engaged to Edward 3 years ago. I need to talk to you urgently about what happened yesterday. Please call me." Isabella read the message 3 times, trying to process it. Edward had been engaged before. He had never mentioned it. She had always assumed he'd had girlfriends, of course, but an engagement was serious, something you mention when you're building a life with someone else. With trembling hands, Isabella dialed the number. Clarissa answered on the second ring. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was soft, but laced with tension. "Hi, this is Isabella. I got your message." There was a sigh of relief. "Thank you for calling. I know this must be very strange, but when a friend of mine told me what happened at the church yesterday, I knew I had to talk to you." "What do you want to tell me?" Isabella asked, already suspecting the answer wouldn't be something she wanted to hear. Clarissa paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "I was engaged to Edward 3 years ago. We were about to get married. Everything was arranged, just like your wedding." But a week before the ceremony, I discovered some things about his business, about documents that had been prepared without my knowledge, putting my name on company's eye. Didn't even know existed. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. Just like what almost happened to me. Exactly, except I found out too late. I called off the wedding, but not before my name had already been used in some preliminary agreements. I spent 2 years fighting in court to untangle myself from everything. 2 years of my life dealing with lawyers, lawsuits, and threats. Threats? Isabella felt fear tighten in her chest. Edward and his family didn't take it well when I exposed their scheme. They tried to silence me in various ways. Nothing physical, you understand. Always within the law, but defamation lawsuits, subpoenas, constant psychological pressure. It was hell. Isabella sat on the couch, her legs feeling weak. But you managed to get free of it all? I did, but not without consequences. I lost my job at the time because the situation was affecting my mental health. I had to move out of Chicago for a while, went to my parents' house in the suburbs. I only came back a few months ago, after I finally managed to clear my name completely. Why didn't you report him? Why did you let him keep doing this? Clarissa sighed. I tried, but Edward and his family have a lot of money, a lot of connections. My lawyer at the time advised me to focus on getting myself out of the situation, not on seeking justice against him. He said it would be a battle I didn't have the resources to win. And he was right. I could barely defend myself, let alone accuse him of anything. Isabella fell silent, processing it all. So I wasn't the first, and I probably wouldn't have been the last if it had worked out. Exactly. Isabella, I'm calling you because You still have time to protect yourself completely. You didn't sign anything, right? No, nothing. I found out everything before. Great. Then you need to act fast. Get a lawyer, a good one, who specializes in corporate law and fraud. Document everything you have on Edward, all the messages, all the strange encounters, everything. And most importantly, keep those documents you found at the church. They are proof that he tried to use you. I don't even know where to start, Isabella admitted, feeling the weight of the situation crashing down on her. I can help. I have the contact information. For the lawyer who represented me. He's good, he's serious, and he knows these schemes very well. I can give you his number if you want. Isabella accepted, wrote down the contact, and thanked her. When she hung up, she sat on the couch for a long time, just staring into space, trying to organize her thoughts. Thor came over and rested his head on her lap, as he always did when he sensed she was upset. On Monday morning, Isabella called the school and requested a week's leave, citing urgent personal matters. The principal, who had certainly already heard about the cancelled wedding, was understanding and granted it without much question. Then Isabella called the lawyer Clarissa had recommended. Dr. Henry Taylor had an office in the Loop, one of Chicago's most corporate areas. Isabella took the L train there, Thor by her side with his service vest indicating he was an assistance animal, which allowed him to accompany her in public places. Some passengers looked curiously at the young, ordinary-looking woman, accompanied by an imposing German shepherd. But Isabella was used to it. Thor was part of her life, her family. The office was discreet, but clearly expensive. A reception with modern furniture, a polite secretary, a view of the city through large windows. Dr. Taylor received her personally, a man in his early 40s with graying temples, a sober suit, and a firm handshake. Isabella, a pleasure. Clarissa called me yesterday, told me about your situation. I'm very sorry for what you're going through. They sat in a conference room, and Isabella began to tell him everything, from the beginning of her relationship with Edward, to Thor's suspicions, to the moment in the church when she discovered the documents. Dr. Taylor listened attentively, taking notes, occasionally asking questions to clarify a point. When Isabella finished, he spent a few minutes reviewing his notes before speaking. Isabella, you were very lucky. If you had gotten married and signed any papers afterward, you would be legally bound to a series of financial obligations you can't even imagine. What Edward tried to do is a relatively common scheme in cases of companies in distress. They use marriage to transfer assets, dilute responsibilities, and create legal shields. But isn't that illegal? It's a gray area. If you had signed everything consciously, knowing what you were getting into, it would just be a questionable but legal financial strategy. The problem is that he tried to deceive you, tried to get you to sign without understanding the consequences. That yes would constitute fraud. But it's difficult to prove, especially against someone with the resources of the Vance family. So I can't do anything. Isabella felt frustration burn in her throat. Dr. Taylor held up a hand, asking for calm. You can do a lot. First, let's formalize this whole situation. I'll prepare a document declaring that you never had any knowledge of or gave consent for your name to be used in Edward's businesses. This will legally protect you in case he tries to claim you had some kind of verbal agreement. And then we'll analyze these documents you found. I need to see exactly what's written in them, which companies are involved, what kind of operations were planned. With that, I can assess whether there's a basis for a formal complaint. Isabella took the documents out of her backpack. She had kept them carefully, every page, every signature. Dr. Taylor began to read, and the more he read, the more serious his expression became. Isabella, this is serious. Very serious. He pointed to some passages. Look, here your name appears as a partner in an offshore company registered in the Cayman Islands, and here as a guarantor for a $7 million loan, and here as the legal representative of a subsidiary construction company that, from what I can see, has several pending labor lawsuits. Isabella felt the floor drop out from under her. $7 million? I could never pay that back in my lifetime. Exactly. And that's the point. If Edward's main construction company went bankrupt, which apparently is close to happening, you, as his wife and a partner in these companies, would be co-responsible for these debts. He was literally transferring the problem to you. But I didn't sign anything. How was he going to do it? Dr. Taylor pointed to a date on the documents. Look here. All these papers have a clause for automatic activation upon marriage. You just had to get married for all of this to legally take effect. And then, at some point in the coming months, he would have you sign a few more documents, probably saying it was just a formality of combining assets between spouses, and you wouldn't even realize you were signing your own financial death warrant. Isabella felt tears well up again. He was going to destroy me. He was going to destroy my entire life just to save his business. Probably, yes. And the worst part is, once done, it would be very difficult to reverse. You would spend years, maybe decades, trying to get rid of those debts, while he would move on, probably trying the same scam on someone else. Like Clarissa, Isabella whispered. Like Clarissa, and certainly others before her. They spent the rest of the morning organizing everything. Dr. Taylor copied all the documents, had Isabella sign a detailed statement of everything that had happened, and promised to start working on the case immediately. When Isabella left the office, it was already late afternoon. The Chicago sky was heavy, threatening rain. She walked with Thor to a nearby park and sat on a bench, watching people pass by. Hurried executives, mothers with strollers, street vendors. The normal life of a huge city, indifferent to the personal dramas of each individual. Her phone rang. It was Edward. Isabella hesitated but answered. Isabella, thank God you answered. His voice sounded desperate. We need to talk. Please, meet me. Just once, let me explain everything. There's nothing to explain, Edward. Isabella was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. I already know everything. I've already spoken to Clarissa. I already have a lawyer. I know exactly what you tried to do to me. There was a silence on the other end. Then Edward spoke, and his voice was different, no longer desperate but cold. Isabella, you have no idea who you're messing with. My family has resources, has connections. If you try to do anything against me, you'll regret it. Was that a threat? Isabella asked, and felt. Thor stand up beside her, alert. It's a warning. You may have found some papers, you may have spoken to a lawyer, but believe me, there are ways to make this very complicated for you. Lawsuits, investigations, your life could become a living hell if you're not reasonable. Reasonable, Isabella repeated, incredulous. Reasonable would have been you being honest with me from the beginning. Reasonable would have been you not trying to use me as a shield for your scams. Reasonable would have been you taking responsibility for your own mistakes. You don't understand how the world works, Isabella. You're a teacher making peanuts, living in a tiny apartment, taking the L train. I was offering you a better life. I was offering you a chance to be somebody." And Isabella, at that moment, fully understood who Edward really was. He wasn't the charming man who had seduced her with expensive dinners and gifts. He wasn't the emotional groom who cried when he talked about their future. He was a manipulator, a man accustomed to using people as pawns in his financial games, without remorse, without empathy. "I already am somebody, Edward. I'm a teacher, I'm a volunteer, I'm a decent person who doesn't need to deceive others to feel important. And you know what? Thank you for showing me who you really are before it was too late." And she hung up. Isabella's hands were shaking, but it was more from anger than fear. Thor nudged her leg with his nose, and she stroked the dog's head. "Let's go home," she said, and started to walk. In the following days, things moved quickly. Dr. Taylor obtained an injunction preventing any document with Isabella's name from being used or registered without her express authorization. He also initiated an investigation into the financial practices of Vance Construction, which caught the attention of regulatory agencies. The story began to leak to the press. Not all the details, but enough for the Vance family to start feeling the pressure. Articles on financial blogs, posts on social media, rumors in Chicago's real estate market. The family's reputation, so carefully built over decades, began to crack. Isabella received a call from Richard. "Isabella, it's Richard. We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you, Richard. You knew everything from the beginning." "That's exactly why I need to talk." Richard paused. "Isabella, I'm going to testify in your favor." "What?" "I can't take it anymore. I helped Edward with this scheme because we've been friends since we were kids, because he convinced me there was no other way. But after seeing what happened at the wedding, after seeing you there, so vulnerable, so deceived, I can't do it anymore. My conscience won't let me." Isabella fell silent, processing. "And what exactly will you testify to?" "Everything. I'll tell them how the scheme was set up, who else was involved, what documents were prepared, what the plan was to get you to sign everything. After the wedding without you realizing it. I'll give everything to your lawyer." "Why are you doing this?" Isabella couldn't quite believe it. "Because it's the right thing to do, and because, honestly, I'm tired of living in this world where everything is business, where people are just pieces in a game. I want to be able to look myself in the mirror and respect myself again." When Isabella told Dr. Taylor about Richard's offer, the lawyer was impressed. "With his testimony, we have a solid case. We can not only protect you but also expose the entire scheme and prevent others from becoming victims." Richard's testimony was formal, recorded with all legal procedures followed. He detailed everything, from the construction company's financial crisis to the specific plans to use the marriage to Isabella as a way to shield assets. He mentioned names, dates, amounts. It was devastating for Edward's defense. The Vance family tried everything. They offered Isabella a settlement, a large sum of money for her to sign a confidentiality agreement, and drop the case. They tried to discredit Richard, claiming he was lying out of revenge. They hired the best lawyers in Chicago to find legal loopholes. But the truth, once exposed, is hard to hide again. Other investors in the construction company began to come forward. Other women who had had brief relationships with Edward in recent years contacted Isabella with similar stories, although none had gone as far as she or Clarissa. The process lasted for 3 months. 3 months of depositions, document analysis, and forensic accounting. Isabella had to relive everything multiple times, tell her story to different authorities, and answer the same questions repeatedly. It was exhausting, it was painful, but she carried on, supported by her mother, her friends, Clarissa, who became a close friend, and especially by Thor, who never left her side. In the end, Vance Construction was forced to undergo a complete restructuring with intervention from regulatory bodies. Edward was removed from his leadership position, and Beatrice had to resign from the board. The family didn't go bankrupt. They had too many resources for that, but their reputation was tarnished, probably forever. Isabella didn't receive financial compensation. She didn't want it. What she wanted was justice, protection, and the assurance that this wouldn't happen to anyone else. And she got it. The case led to changes in regulations regarding transparency in prenuptial agreements and served as a precedent for other similar cases. When it was all finally over, it was March, and Chicago was beginning to feel the warmth of approaching spring. Isabella returned to her classes at school, returned to her volunteer work at the shelter, returned to her simple but honest life. One afternoon she was in the park with Thor when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. She answered cautiously. "Isabella, this is Marina Alcott from Meadowlark Press. I've been reading about your case in the news and I'd like to talk to you about the possibility of writing a book telling your story." "A book?" "Yes. We believe your story can help many women identify abusive and manipulative relationships before it's too late. Would you be interested?" Isabella looked at Thor, who was watching her with those intelligent eyes. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but know that your story is important, Isabella, and it deserves to be told." When she hung up, Isabella sat on the park grass, Thor lying beside her. She thought about everything she had been through, how her life had completely changed in a matter of months. She thought about what could have happened if Thor hadn't insisted on warning her, if she hadn't had the courage to listen to that instinct, telling her something was wrong. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, telling her story really could help other people. It could be the light at the end of the tunnel for someone going through something similar. Chapter 4. A New Beginning. 6 months had passed since that Saturday at St. Jude's Cathedral. 6 months that had transformed Isabella Miller in ways she could never have imagined that morning when she woke up in her wedding dress, about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The book was published in August at the height of the Chicago summer. Isabella had decided to accept the publisher's proposal, but with one condition: a portion of the profits would be donated to organizations that helped women in situations of vulnerability and manipulation. The chosen title was simple: When Instinct Speaks, a direct reference to the role Thor had played in her salvation. The launch took place at a bookstore in the Wicker Park neighborhood on a Saturday afternoon. Isabella was nervous, wearing a simple navy blue dress, her hair loose on her shoulders with discreet makeup. Thor was by her side, of course, wearing a new bandana that Carol had insisted he wear for the occasion. The dog, as always, was alert but calm, fulfilling his role as a silent guardian. The bookstore was packed. Isabella hadn't expected so many people. There were her teacher friends, work colleagues, people from the animal shelter, her mother Marissa in a party dress Isabella hadn't seen in years, and to her surprise, Clarissa Moore, accompanied by a man she introduced as her current boyfriend. But what moved Isabella the most was seeing several unknown women holding copies of the book, waiting to talk to her. Women of all ages, some young like her, others older, each with her own story, her own battle. One of them, a white-haired lady named Eleanor, approached with teary eyes. "Isabella, I read your book in 2 days. I couldn't put it down. And you know why? Because I spent 40 years married to a man who did exactly what Edward tried to do to you. Only in my day, there was no internet, no way to research, no way to know. I signed everything. He asked me to, trusting him. When he passed away, I discovered I was drowning in debts I never knew existed. I've spent the last 5 years of my life selling everything to pay creditors. Your book," she clutched the copy to her chest, "made me understand that I wasn't stupid, I wasn't weak. I was deceived, and that makes all the difference." Isabella hugged Eleanor, feeling tears stream down her own face. It was for women like her that she had decided to make her story public, to expose her vulnerability, to admit her errors in judgment. The book signing lasted 3 hours. Every woman who approached the table where Isabella sat brought a story, a connection to what she had lived through. Some had escaped similar situations, others hadn't been so lucky, and others were currently in relationships that left them with that feeling Isabella knew so well. The instinct saying something was wrong, but the mind trying to rationalize, to find excuses, to believe in the promises. For each of them, Isabella had the same words: "Listen to your instinct. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And don't be ashamed to leave, no matter how much time you've invested, no matter what people will think. Your safety, your mental health, your freedom are worth more than any relationship. When night fell and the bookstore began to empty, Carol, Francis, Clarissa, and Marissa took Isabella to dinner at a nearby Italian restaurant. They ordered wine, pasta, risotto, and spent hours talking, laughing, reminiscing. "Can you believe it's only been 6 months?" Isabella said, swirling the wine in her glass. "It feels like a lifetime ago." "You're different," Francis observed. "Stronger, you know, like you found something inside yourself you didn't know existed." Isabella smiled. "I think that's right. For a long time I defined myself by my limitations. I was just a teacher, made little money, lived from paycheck to paycheck, had no glamour, no status. When Edward showed up, offering this fairy tale life, I felt validated, you know, like I was finally good enough for something better. And now," Carol asked, "now I know I was always good enough. I don't need a rich man, a spectacular wedding, a life that isn't mine to feel valuable. I have my job that I love. I have my students who fill me with pride. I have Thor who literally saved my life. I have you all. That's enough. That's more than enough." Marissa squeezed her daughter's hand across the table, her eyes shining with tears and pride. "I always knew you were strong, my daughter. I was just waiting for you to discover it too." They toasted, and Isabella looked around the table at the women who had supported her through the most difficult times, who never judged her, who held her hand when she thought she would fall apart. And she felt a deep, visceral gratitude for being lucky enough to have them in her life. The following Monday, Isabella returned to school. Her art classes were fuller than ever. The story had spread, and many students came to talk to her after class, asking for advice, sharing their own stories of complicated relationships, manipulative parents, toxic friendships. Isabella realized her role had expanded beyond just teaching art. She had become, without planning it, a kind of mentor, someone the teenagers felt could understand, who had been through something real and survived. One day, a 16-year-old student named Beatrice stayed after class. "Miss Miller, can I talk to you?" "Of course, Beatrice, sit down." The girl sat, nervous, fidgeting with her hands. "It's just, there's this boy in my class. We started dating 3 months ago. At first, everything was perfect. He was super attentive, gave me gifts, always wanted to be with me. But lately, he's been getting weird. He gets mad when I want to hang out with my friends. Says if I really liked him, I'd want to spend all my free time with him. Yesterday, he took my phone and started reading my texts, saying it was because he loved me and wanted to make sure I wasn't talking to other boys." Isabella felt her heart ache. She knew exactly where this was going. "And how do you feel about that, Beatrice?" The girl hesitated. I think it's weird. But he says it's normal in relationships, that real couples don't have secrets. And some of his friends say, I should feel lucky he cares so much." "Beatrice," Isabella took the girl's hand, looking into her eyes, "I'm going to tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age. Real love doesn't control. It doesn't invade. It doesn't limit. Real love makes you feel freer, not less. If you're feeling watched, if you have to explain every conversation, every outing, every friendship, that's not love. That's control. And it might seem like it comes from a place of caring, but it doesn't. It comes from insecurity, from possessiveness, and it only tends to get worse over time." Beatrice's eyes filled with tears. "I think I already knew that deep down. But it's so hard to break up, you know? Everyone thinks we're the perfect couple. He's handsome, popular, everyone says I'm lucky. Your luck doesn't depend on being with someone, Beatrice. Your luck is that you realized early on that something is wrong. It's having the courage to listen to that discomfort you're feeling instead of ignoring it because everyone says you should be happy. Trust your instinct. It's trying to protect you." That conversation stayed in Isabella's mind for days. She realized the problem was much bigger than just her case with Edward or the cases of the women who had read her book. It was a cultural issue, a way of teaching girls and women to ignore their instincts, to prioritize being loved over being safe, to accept problematic behaviors in the name of love. That's when Isabella had an idea. What if she created a project at school? A series of workshops on healthy relationships, on how to identify warning signs, on how to value one's own intuition. She took the proposal to the principal, who loved it and approved it immediately. The workshops began in September, and the turnout was surprising. Not just students, but also teachers, and even some parents showed up. Isabella invited Clarissa to co-facilitate some sessions, and together they created a safe space where people could share experiences, ask questions, and learn to recognize patterns of manipulation and emotional abuse. Thor, of course, was present at every session. Isabella had incorporated him as part of the program, using the story of how the dog saved her to illustrate the importance of paying attention to signs, even when they come from unexpected sources. The kids and teenagers loved Thor, and the German Shepherd seemed to understand his role, remaining calm as the young people approached to pet him, asking questions about his police training. In October, almost a year after that fateful Saturday, Isabella received an unexpected invitation. A national women's rights organization wanted to honor her at an event in Washington, D.C. She would be recognized for her courage in exposing a financial manipulation scheme and for using her experience to educate and empower other women. Isabella hesitated. The idea of being the center of attention, of being treated as some kind of hero, made her uncomfortable. She didn't see herself that way. She saw herself as someone who got lucky, who had a smart dog, who had support at the right time. But Carol convinced her. "Isa, you don't understand the impact you've had. Your book has already sold 50,000 copies. 50,000 women have read your story. How many of them do you think identified something similar in their own lives? How many found the courage to leave dangerous situations because of you? Accept the honor, not for you, but for all of them." And so Isabella went to D.C., accompanied by Marissa and, of course, Thor. The event took place in an elegant hotel with several dignitaries present, other women being honored for different reasons, all united by the courage to turn their pain into strength. When it was Isabella's turn to go on stage to receive the recognition plaque, she was nervous, but when she looked out at the audience and saw so many female faces looking at her with admiration and gratitude, she felt a calm wash over her. She took the microphone and began to speak, unscripted, letting her heart guide the words. "I don't feel like a hero. I feel like a woman who almost made a terrible mistake and was lucky enough to escape in time. But if my story can help one person, just one person, to question, to investigate, to trust their own instinct, then all the exposure, all the vulnerability was worth it." She looked at Thor, who was sitting calmly at the side of the stage. "I have a dog who was trained to detect danger. He sniffed out substances, identified threats, protected people. And when this dog repeatedly warned me about the man I was going to marry, I almost ignored him. I almost chose to believe the beautiful words instead of trusting the honed instinct of an animal that had never let me down." A pause, a deep breath. How many of us do that? We ignore our own instinct, that inner voice that says something is wrong because we so badly want to believe in the romantic story, the happy ending, the love that conquers all. How many of us normalize questionable behaviors because we've been told that relationships require sacrifice, require forgiveness, require understanding? She saw several women in the audience nodding in agreement. My message today is simple. Listen to your instinct. If something feels wrong, investigate. If someone is asking for secrets, for documents signed in a hurry, for decisions made without time to think, question it. If a relationship is making you feel smaller, weaker, more dependent instead of stronger, reevaluate. And most importantly, she continued, don't be ashamed to change your mind. Don't be ashamed to call off weddings, to end long relationships, to admit you were wrong. It's better to face one day of embarrassment than years of regret. It's better to disappoint a few people than to destroy your own life. The applause was deafening. Women stood up, some crying, others smiling, all connected by that shared truth Isabella had articulated. After the event, several women approached her, some to thank her, others to share their own stories, others simply to hug her in a gesture of silent solidarity that needed no words. On the flight back to Chicago, Isabella looked out the airplane window, watching the city lights approach as they descended. Marissa was sleeping in the seat next to her, and Thor was lying at her feet in the area designated for service animals. Isabella thought about everything that had changed in the last year. She had lost a fiancé but gained a voice. She had escaped a wedding but found a purpose. She had exposed her vulnerability but discovered her strength. She also thought about Edward, though less and less frequently. She had heard through indirect sources that he had left Chicago, was living in a smaller town, working on smaller projects, far from the spotlight. The Vance family had recovered financially. Rich families always have ways of recovering, but their reputation was permanently stained. Isabella didn't feel anger towards him anymore. She felt pity for a man who had so much but didn't know how to value what truly matters, who preferred to manipulate rather than love, to deceive rather than trust, to use rather than share. But mostly, Isabella felt gratitude. Gratitude for Thor, who never gave up on warning her. Gratitude for her mother, who always taught her to listen to her heart. Gratitude for her friends who stood by her side. Gratitude for Clarissa, who had the courage to reach out and share her own story. Gratitude for every woman who read her book and found in it a mirror for her own situation. The plane landed smoothly at O'Hare Airport. It was a Friday night, and Chicago shone below, pulsating, vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful, as always. Isabella took Thor by the leash, helped Marissa with her carry-on, and they started walking towards the exit. In the taxi on the way home, Marissa broke the silence. "You know I'm proud of you, right, my daughter?" Isabella smiled. "I know, Mom. Not just proud. Impressed. You turned something terrible into something beautiful. You took your pain and made it a tool to help other people. That is," she paused, searching for the right words, "that is what it means to be truly strong." When they arrived at the apartment, Julia had left a note on the fridge. "Welcome back, superstar. There's lasagna in the oven. Just heat it up. I'll tell you all the gossip tomorrow. Kisses." Isabella heated up the lasagna, shared a little with Thor, even though she knew she shouldn't give him human food, but it was a special occasion, and ate sitting on the couch watching a cooking show on TV. Later, lying in bed with Thor at her feet as always, Isabella picked up her phone and opened the Notes app. She began to write down ideas for the next workshop at school, thinking about themes that hadn't yet been covered, stories that could be shared, ways to reach more people. Because Isabella had realized something important. Her journey hadn't ended that Saturday in the church. That had just been the beginning of a new version of herself, a version that wasn't afraid to use her voice, that wasn't ashamed of her strength, that understood that vulnerability and courage are not opposites, but complements. And as she planned, wrote, and dreamed of all she could still do, Isabella looked at Thor. The dog was watching her with those deep, intelligent, loyal eyes, and she whispered, "Thank you, my friend. Thank you for never giving up on me." Thor tilted his head, as if he understood, and laid his head on his paws, finally relaxing completely, because his mission was accomplished. He had protected his human, he had saved her life. He had done exactly what he was trained to do, detect danger and sound the alarm before it was too late. And Isabella, finally at peace with herself, at peace with her choices, at peace with her uncertain but authentic future, turned off the light and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be another day of classes, of conversations with students, of volunteer work at the shelter, of a life that was ordinary and simple and real. And she wouldn't trade it for anything. Not for the mansion in the Gold Coast, not for the sophisticated dinners, not for the social status that marrying Edward would have given her. Because now she had something much more valuable. She had herself back. She had her freedom, her dignity, her authenticity. And that, Isabella smiled in the dark, is priceless. The following months brought more changes. Isabella's book was translated into Spanish and released in several Latin American countries. She began receiving invitations to give lectures at universities, at companies, at corporate events on ethics and transparency. in professional and personal relationships. Each lecture was an opportunity to reach more people, to plant more seeds of awareness. And Isabella always made sure to mention Thor, to always emphasize that sometimes warning signs come from unexpected places and that our job is to be open to receiving them. The animal shelter where she volunteered received a wave of donations after her story became public. Many people mentioned they had been inspired by Thor's story and wanted to support the work of rehabilitating retired police and military dogs. Isabella also started a podcast called Instinct, where she interviewed women who had gone through similar situations, who had escaped toxic or manipulative relationships, who had found strength in moments of weakness. Each episode was a lesson, a window into different realities, proof that no matter how dark a situation may seem, there is always a way out, always hope. One day, almost 18 months after that Saturday in the church, Isabella received a letter. It was from a woman named Helen from Milwaukee. The letter read, "Dear Isabella, I'm writing to you because I need you to know that you saved my life. 6 months ago, I was engaged to a man who, like Edward, was trying to involve me in financial schemes I didn't understand. Was feeling confused, pressured, but I thought it was just wedding jitters. Then a friend gave me your book. I read it in one night, crying through almost every page because it felt like you were telling my story. The next day I called off the wedding. My family thought I had gone crazy. But I followed your advice. I listened to my instinct. Today I found out he was involved in frauds much worse than I had imagined. He's under investigation. If I had married him, I would have been dragged down with him. You saved me, Isabella, and I don't have the words to thank you." Isabella read that letter several times, tears streaming freely. This was why. It was for women like Helen that it had all been worth it. Every moment of exposure, every awkward interview, every time she had to relive that day in the church in front of strangers. It was all worth it if it meant one more woman was safe, one more life was protected. And as time went on, Isabella realized that her own healing was happening in the moments she helped others. Each workshop, each lecture, each conversation with a reader, each podcast episode was another layer of healing over the wound Edward had left. She also started dating again, accepting invitations for coffee, dinner, social events. She wasn't looking for a relationship, but she wasn't closed off to the possibility either. Only now, armed with self-knowledge and with the warning signs well defined in her mind, she knew exactly what to look for, and more importantly, what to avoid. On one of these outings, at a contemporary art exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago, Isabella met Raphael. He was an architect who worked on affordable housing projects, passionate about transforming blighted urban spaces into community areas. They talked for hours about art, about the city, about purpose. And when Isabella mentioned Thor, Raphael not only accepted it, but was enthusiastic about the idea of meeting the dog. On their first official date, Raphael showed up at Isabella's apartment with a gift, a book on canine body language and how to better understand the signals dogs give. It was a simple gesture, but it showed Isabella that he had paid attention, that he understood Thor's importance in her life. And Thor, who was usually so wary of men after the experience with Edward, approached Raphael cautiously but without hostility. He sniffed, investigated, and then, to Isabella's surprise, sat next to the architect and let him pet him. Isabella watched the scene with a heart tight with emotion. It was as if Thor was giving his approval, saying that this time it was okay, that this man posed no danger. Raphael looked at her and smiled. "I think I passed the test." Isabella laughed. "The most important test of all." The relationship with Raphael was completely different from what it had been with Edward. It was slow, unhurried, built on honest conversations, total transparency, and mutual respect. Raphael never tried to control, never made a mystery of his finances, never asked for secrets. He was a partner in the truest sense of the word. But Isabella was different too. She was no longer the naive woman who was dazzled by expensive dinners and luxurious gifts. She was someone who valued authenticity over appearance, substance over form. Someone who wasn't afraid to ask tough questions, to set boundaries, to say no when something didn't feel right. 2 years after that fateful Saturday, on a particularly beautiful autumn day in Chicago, Isabella was sitting in a park with Raphael. Thor was playing with a frisbee that Raphael had brought, and they watched the dog run and jump, his joy contagious. "Have you ever thought about getting married again?" Raphael asked, casually, but with a weight in his voice that Isabella recognized. She was silent for a moment, considering. "Honestly, I have, but not in the way I used to think about it. I don't want a huge ceremony. I don't want to prove anything to anyone. If I get married again, it will be something intimate, simple, with only the people who really matter." "And would you think about marrying me?" Raphael asked, this time looking directly at her. Isabella felt her heart speed up, but it wasn't the same nervousness as before. It was something different, something more solid, more real. "I would, yes, but it would have to be my way. No surprises, no secret documents, no games. Everything open, everything discussed, everything decided together." Raphael smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you. And for the record, Thor would have to give his formal approval before anything else." Isabella laughed, a genuine laugh that came from deep in her chest. "Definitely. Thor has veto power in this family. They didn't get engaged that day. There was no official proposal, no ring. But there was a conversation, a shared decision to build something together, in their own time, in their own way. And for Isabella, that was far more valuable than any rehearsed romantic gesture. Because she had learned the hard way that what matters in a relationship isn't the grand gestures, the public declarations, the grandiose promises. What matters are the small things, the honesty in everyday conversations, the respect for individual decisions, the transparency of intentions, the genuine partnership in facing challenges." And as she watched Thor run free in the park, the sun setting in the background painting the Chicago sky with shades of orange and pink, Isabella felt a deep peace. It wasn't the peace of someone who has all the answers, but the peace of someone who has learned to ask the right questions. It wasn't the peace of someone who will never suffer again, but the peace of someone who knows she has the strength to survive and grow from suffering. Thor came running back, the frisbee in his mouth, and dropped it at Isabella's feet. She picked it up and threw it far, watching the dog dash after it, and she thought that in the end perhaps this was the greatest lesson Thor had taught her, the importance of chasing what makes you happy, but also the wisdom to know when to stop, when to retreat, when to protect. And Isabella finally had learned to do both, to chase her dreams, but also to protect her heart, her mind, her life. It was a delicate balance, but she was learning to navigate it one day at a time.